Hello, ladies, gentlemen, and others. I'm George Jones, aka The Peculiar Lefty, and I've created a YouTube channel for my thoughts, music, and semi-coherent rants. For my first video, I've decided to focus on something that a lot of people have been talking about lately. That's the idea of democratic socialism. Now, to begin with, I think I should clarify some terms I'll be using in the video. First, socialism. Socialism is worker ownership of the means of production, as opposed to capitalism, which is private ownership of the means of production. Socialism is not nationalisation, free healthcare, any of the other shit liberals talk about. It's about the working class controlling the economy. It's about you having equal control of the place where you work. Democratic socialism, in particular, is an ideology that says we can achieve socialism through electoral politics. I've heard it described as a baby steps approach, where you have like gradual small reforms that eventually add up, like will take us to a full-on socialist economy. This stands opposed to revolutionary socialism, which is the belief that we need to forcibly overthrow the ruling class and seize the means of production. Now, when people talk about democratic socialism, one of the examples I often use to argue for it is the post-war Labour government led by Clement Attlee. Now, it's true that Labour under Clement Attlee did do a lot of great things. They created the NHS, the British welfare state, and other reforms that have greatly benefited the British population, both back then and as time has gone by up to the present day. But there are a few things that far too many people ignore. First, they assume that what Attlee did was purely a matter of government policy, and that if we elect Jeremy Corbyn, then he can do the same thing. He can just write some policies into law, and we'll be back to the post-war consensus. Fact is, though, that that's not how it works. History is not driven by the actions of individual people or the decisions of governments. Fundamentally, history is driven by material conditions. And the conditions in 1945 were very different from conditions now, which is why the capitalist class allowed Attlee and the rest of the Labour government to make those reforms. For a start, in 1945, there was a much stronger socialist movement in the UK. A lot more people understood and supported the ideas of socialism. A lot more people were involved in unions which were much more radical and much more militant than the modern reformist unions that are mostly in bed with the bosses at the top level. And on top of that, you had a lot more people who were a genuine threat if they did get riled up enough to do anything. I mean, if you look at the number of people who had served in World War II, you had a sizable proportion of British workers who were pissed off, socially conscious combat veterans, and that is not something that the ruling class took lightly. In the words of a Conservative MP at the time, if we don't give them reform, they'll give us revolution. And of course, both workers and capitalists could look abroad to see what that revolution might look like. They could look to the USSR, where there had been a socialist revolution which to a certain extent had been successful. They could look at China, where there was a revolution in progress. They could even look at the militant labour struggles in Britain and the US a few years before, with the Red Clydesiders in Scotland, with the various labour disputes during World War I, and in America with things like the Battle of Blair Mountain, where there were mass uprisings against the capitalist order. And that was much more immediate to them than it is to us today. You know, for us, that was 100 years ago or near enough, whereas for them it was within their lifetimes. And the spectre of a country, of the USSR, of a country where a socialist party had actually taken power, served as an inspiration to the workers, and it was terrifying to the people in power because it made that threat all the more real. It was that threat of an armed revolt that pushed the ruling class into making such significant concessions. Now, to see what it looks like when you try and bring in democratic socialist reforms without that threat backing you up, just look at Venezuela. In 1999, Hugo Chavez was elected president of Venezuela. He imposed various reforms that were supposed to be stepping stones on Venezuela's road to socialism, and for a while these reforms were enormously successful. But then, look what happened. The capitalist class, the global capitalist class, destroyed the Venezuelan economy. They ended up driving them into a condition where people are living in terrible poverty, There are shortages of basic goods due to people withdrawing investments, people refusing to do business with Venezuela, and people hoarding goods. For example, recently, the government managed to seize enough medical supplies from a single hoarder to serve the country's needs for 2 years. That's the level of withholding of goods that you're seeing in Venezuela by capitalists. Eventually, this pressure led to Chavez's successor, Maduro, being voted out in favour of a right-wing party earlier this year. Now, why did that happen? Well, it's pretty simple, really. Firstly, there just wasn't enough pressure on the ruling class for them to allow the reforms to stand. It was in their interests to fight against the Bolivarian revolution, and secondly, they still had control of the economy. And that's why they won. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter what government you elect. The people who control the economy control the country, and the people who control the means of production control the economy. Now, I was going to say at the end of this video that democratic socialism is like bringing a knife to a gunfight, but it's really more like turning up to a gunfight unarmed and expecting everybody else to put down their weapons and settle their differences with a game of rock, paper, scissors. If you want to end capitalism, you have to take away the power of the capitalists, which at the end of the day means taking away their property. I've been the Peculiar Lefty. Thanks for watching.